It's a Tuesday night in Chicago, 1968. You're sitting at a red light on West Grand Avenue, windows down, the smell of exhaust hanging in the summer air. You've got a brand new Camaro SS 396 under you. 375 horsepower of Detroit muscle. You paid good money for this thing. You got the stripes, the hood vents, the whole package. People turn their heads when you drive by. You know what you have. Then something pulls up beside you. It's a Dodge Dart, plain white, steel wheels with little dog dish hubcaps, no stripes, no scoops, no badges worth reading. It looks like a rental car. It looks like something your uncle drives to the grocery store. The guy behind the wheel doesn't even look at you. He's just sitting there, both hands on the wheel, waiting. The light turns green. By the time your brain registers what's happening, that Dart is already gone. Not just ahead of you, gone. 2 car lengths, 3 car lengths, and still pulling. You're flat on the gas in your brand new SS 396, and you're watching taillights disappear into the night. The quarter mile comes and goes before you've even processed the humiliation. 11.7 seconds at 117 miles per hour. That little grocery getter just ran a number that would embarrass a Hemi. You just got destroyed by a car that, technically speaking, should not exist. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden age of muscle cars and the lunatics who built them. If you're someone who lives for the stories behind the machines, the backroom engineering, the rule breaking, the sheer human obsession with going faster, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. What you just witnessed at that stoplight was the 1968 Dodge Dart GSS 440, and the story of how it came to exist is one of the most fascinating chapters in American automotive history, because this wasn't built by a team of engineers in a corporate facility with $1 million budget. It wasn't developed over years of wind tunnel testing and computer simulations. It was built by one man, in a dealership service bay, in Chicago, with a cutting torch, a welder, and a complete disregard for what the lawyers thought. His name was Norman Kraus, but everyone called him Mr. Norm. To understand why the GSS 440 was such a seismic event, you have to understand what was happening in the muscle car world in 1968. Look, the arms race between Detroit manufacturers had reached genuinely insane levels by this point. Pontiac had the GTO pumping out 400 horsepower. Chevrolet's SS 396 was terrorizing drag strips across the country. Ford had just dropped the 428 Cobra Jet Mustang, and it was cleaning up everywhere. Every manufacturer was locked in a cubic inch war, and every month somebody was announcing a bigger number, a higher horsepower rating, a faster quarter mile time. But here's the thing. There was an unspoken rule that everybody followed. Big engines win in big cars. Your GTOs, your Roadrunners, your Chevy, they were all mid-sized platforms, and the reason was simple engineering reality. A 440 cubic inch engine weighs 670 pounds. That's not a number you casually drop into a lightweight compact without the entire front end collapsing under you. The suspension, the frame, the cooling system, the rear axle, all of it had to be engineered from the ground up to handle that kind of mass and torque. Stuffing these monsters into small cars wasn't just unconventional, it was considered genuinely impossible by everyone who actually understood the engineering involved. Now, you might be thinking, well, if it was impossible, how did Mr. Norm do it? That's exactly the right question. And the answer says everything about the difference between people who follow conventional wisdom and people who actually solve problems. Mr. Norm ran Grand Spalding Dodge on West Grand Avenue in Chicago, and calling it just a dealership would be like calling Carroll Shelby just a race car driver. This place was ground zero for high-performance Mopar development. While other dealers were content to move whatever Detroit shipped them, Mr. Norm was in his service bay every night taking things apart, figuring out what the limits actually were versus what people just assumed they were. There's a difference between those two things, and most people never bother to find out. The idea crystallized when Mr. Norm was staring at a regular Dart GTS equipped with a 333 engine. 300 horsepower in a 3,200-pound car. Respectable, quick. But Mr. Norm wasn't interested in respectable. He was doing what engineers and hot rodders have always done, looking at what's there and asking what else could fit. Here's what most people don't realize about that moment. The 383 and the 440 shared the same fundamental architecture. Same engine mount locations, same bell housing bolt pattern. The 440 was bigger, heavier, wider, but the bones were similar. To someone who didn't know cars, that sounds like good news. To an actual engineer, it sounds like a nightmare because similar and identical are completely different things in fabrication. The 440 was 34 inches wide at the valve covers. The Dart's engine bay was designed for slant sixes and small blocks, maxing out at around 30 inches. 4 inches doesn't sound like much until you're trying to close the hood, but Mr. Norm saw a path, and that's what separated him from everyone else. This is where it gets really interesting, because the engine he chose to use wasn't just any 440. Chrysler built several versions of this engine. You had your standard 440, your 440 Magnum, both strong motors, both capable of serious performance. But buried inside Chrysler's commercial truck division was something that nobody in the passenger car world was paying attention to: the 440 high performance. This was a commercial truck and police interceptor engine developed specifically for sustained high-output applications, and it was an entirely different animal. The cylinder heads alone told the whole story. The 9,006 cylinder heads that came on the truck spec 440 featured intake valves measuring 2.08 inches in diameter. Now, if you're not a gearhead, that number might not mean anything to you. So here's the analogy. Imagine trying to breathe through a drinking straw versus breathing through a garden hose. The difference in airflow is the difference between a strong engine and a genuinely terrifying one. Bigger valves mean more air gets in, more fuel gets burned, more power comes out. It's that simple, and it's that significant. The camshaft was essentially a race piece that somehow ended up in a commercial application. 276 degrees of duration with 0.481 inches of lift. The valve springs were engineered to handle 6,000 RPM, which for a big block displacing 440 cubic inches was completely unheard of. Most big blocks were happy living between 2,000 and 4,000 RPM. This one was built to breathe hard all the way to the red line and keep asking for more. Compression ratio sat at 10 and 10.5 to 1. That required premium fuel, but it also meant that when the combustion event happened, it happened with authority. The bottom end matched the top end in terms of seriousness. Forged steel crankshaft, forged aluminum pistons, heavy-duty connecting rods designed for commercial duty cycles, which meant they were built to take punishment that passenger car components would never survive. The carburation came from a Carter AFB 4-barrel unit flowing 625 CFM, fed through an aluminum intake manifold that saved precious weight over the cast iron versions. Here's the thing about that engine in context. It was never supposed to see the inside of a passenger car. It existed to push police interceptors through high-speed pursuits and haul commercial loads without grenading itself. The people who designed it weren't thinking about drag strips, they were thinking about durability and sustained output. And that industrial-grade durability, combined with those race-spec breathing components, created something genuinely special. Mr. Norm recognized it immediately. This wasn't just a big engine, this was the right engine. Now the real work began. The first problem was physical fitment, and it was substantial. 4 inches of extra width doesn't disappear on its own. Mr. Norm's solution required cutting and modifying the inner fenders, which sounds simple when you say it fast, but represents hours of careful fabrication work. Cut too little and the engine doesn't fit. Cut too much and you compromise structural integrity. Every cut had to be precise. Every modification had to be reinforced. The power steering pump had to be completely relocated. The master cylinder needed a remote reservoir because there was simply no room for it in its original position. The battery got moved to the trunk, which actually helped weight distribution more than most people realize. And then there was the cooling problem, because this is where most engine swap projects fail. Getting the engine in is one challenge. Keeping it from destroying itself with heat is a completely different one. A 440 at full throttle generates approximately 185,000 BTUs per hour of waste heat. The stock Dart radiator would have turned that engine bay into a furnace within minutes. Mr. Norm sourced a 26-inch heavy-duty radiator from Chrysler's B-body parts bin, the same large platform cars that were factory-built to handle big block heat loads. Then he fabricated custom mounting brackets to make it fit in a space it was never designed for. He added a 7-blade viscous fan that moved 2,800 cubic feet of air per minute, nearly double what the stock unit was capable of. Here's what most people don't realize about cooling systems and engine swaps. The radiator size is only part of the equation. Airflow management matters just as much. A radiator can only reject heat as fast as air moves through it. Get the airflow wrong, and it doesn't matter how big your radiator is, you'll still overheat. Mr. Norm understood this. The fan shroud, the airflow routing, the underhood ventilation, all of it was considered and addressed. This wasn't trial and error. This was systematic engineering performed by someone who understood thermodynamics even if he'd never taken a formal class in it. The exhaust system required what I can only describe as creative sculpture. The 440's wider cylinder heads meant the stock Dart exhaust manifolds were completely useless. Headers were mandatory, but nothing existed off the shelf because nobody had ever done the swap before. Mr. Norm had to design and fabricate custom headers from scratch. 1. 0.87 5-inch primary tubes that had to snake around the steering linkage, the starter motor, the frame rails, and about a dozen other components that were never designed to share space with pipes this size. Each individual tube required multiple precision bends just to clear essential components. The collectors fed into a custom dual exhaust system with minimal muffling. Subtlety was not the objective. Look, this is the part of the build that gets overlooked when people tell this story. Everybody talks about the engine. Not everybody talks about the fabrication skill required to make it work. Anyone can bolt a big engine to an engine stand, making it fit in a car, making the exhaust breathe properly, making the cooling work, making the whole system function reliably under hard use. That's where the real engineering lives. And Mr. Norm was doing all of it without CAD software, without laser measurement tools, without the resources of a corporate engineering department. He was doing it with experience, intuition, and skill built over years of wrenching. The transmission presented its own set of challenges. 480 pound-feet of torque at just 2,800 RPM. That number needs a moment to land. That's commercial truck torque. The stock 904 torque flight automatic transmission that came in the Dart would have been destroyed on the first hard launch. Not damaged. Destroyed. Mr. Norm specified the heavy-duty 727 torque flight, the same unit Chrysler used behind their legendary 426 Hemi engines. But it didn't bolt to the existing crossmember, which meant more cutting, more welding, more custom fabrication. The 727 came equipped with a high stall torque converter rated at 2,800 RPM. This is where it gets really interesting, because that torque converter choice was genuinely brilliant. The 440's aggressive camshaft created a loping, hunting idle that barely held together below 1,000 RPM. A stock torque converter would have made the car nearly undrivable on public streets, bucking and stalling at every traffic light and intersection. The high stall unit allowed the engine to climb into its actual power band before the drivetrain engaged, transforming what could have been a frustrating street car into something that launched with immediate savage authority. It was the difference between a weapon and a science project. The rear axle situation was, to put it plainly, non-negotiable. The stock 8.25-inch rear end that came in the Dart was a perfectly adequate unit for the engines it was designed to handle. Put 480 pound-feet of torque through it and you wouldn't get a second chance to find out how inadequate it was. It would detonate on the first serious launch. Not might detonate, would detonate. Mr. Norm knew this, and he went straight to the nuclear option. The Dana 60 Sure Grip Differential. If you know anything about Mopar performance history, that name means something to you. The Dana 60 was the rear end that serious racers specified when they needed something that simply would not break. 35 spline axle shafts, a 9.75-inch ring gear, a differential housing that could handle over 600 horsepower without complaint. This was the same unit going into professional drag racing applications. Putting it under a compact Dart was the automotive equivalent of installing submarine-grade hardware in a speedboat, completely over-engineered for the application, which is exactly the point. Most DSS cars received either 4.10 or 4.30 gear ratios, not because Mr. Norm was building a highway cruiser, because he was building something that needed to win the first 440 feet more than it needed to win anything after that. Now, you might be thinking, okay, big engine, strong drivetrain makes sense, but what about the suspension? Because here's the thing that people who haven't actually built performance cars sometimes miss. Power means nothing if the car can't put it to the ground. And a heavy engine in a compact car that wasn't designed for it creates weight distribution problems that can make a powerful car genuinely slower than a less powerful one with better setup. Mr. Norm understood this better than almost anyone. The stud dive front springs would have compressed under the 440's weight until the nose was dragging the pavement. He replaced them with heavy-duty torsion bars from Chrysler's police package, rated at 0.92 inches compared to the stock 0.87. That difference in diameter sounds small. In torsion bar engineering, it represents a significant increase in spring rate. The rear received super stock leaf springs with an additional leaf and stiffer bushings. These weren't just load-bearing upgrades. They were specifically calibrated to manage weight transfer under hard acceleration, to plant the rear tires at the moment of launch, rather than allowing the rear to rise and the front to squat uncontrollably. Here's what most people don't realize about weight transfer in drag racing. You actually want the rear to squat slightly under acceleration. It increases rear tire contact patch and improves traction, but too much squat and the car becomes unpredictable. The suspension geometry has to be tuned to find that narrow window where weight transfer works for you instead of against you. Mr. Norm found that window through testing and adjustment, the old-fashioned way. The final weight distribution came out to 54% front, 46% rear. Now compare that to a factory Roadrunner or GTO with a big block. Those cars typically ran closer to 58 or 59% front weight bias because of their heavier engines sitting in larger engine bays with less compensation for the added mass. Mr. Norm's careful use of aluminum components, the battery relocation, the weight of specific parts chosen throughout the build, all of it contributed to a front-through-rear balance that was actually superior to the factory muscle cars the GSS was competing against. A car with better weight distribution hooks up better. A car that hooks up better wins races regardless of raw horsepower numbers. The induction system received attention that went beyond simply bolting on a carburetor. Mr. Norm developed a fresh air induction setup that pulled cool air from the base of the windshield. And here's the physics behind why that matters. Cool air is denser than hot air. More dense air contains more oxygen molecules per cubic foot. More oxygen means more complete combustion. For every 10-degree drop in intake air temperature, you gain approximately 1% in horsepower. Underhood temperatures in a hard-driven big block application can reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit or more. The air at the base of the windshield, shielded from direct engine heat, might be running 80 degrees on a warm day. That's a 60-degree differential. Do the math. 6% power increase. On an engine making somewhere north of 400 horsepower, that's a genuine 25 horsepower that costs nothing except thoughtful engineering. The ignition system was the final piece of the puzzle, and Mr. Norm treated it with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. Dual-point distributor with 38 degrees of total advance dialed in, a chrome ignition box with higher voltage output than stock, solid core plug wires capable of handling the increased spark energy without bleeding voltage, NGK racing plugs gapped at 35 thousandths of an inch. This setup could reliably light off the air-fuel mixture all the way to 6,500 RPM, territory where stock ignition systems would begin misfiring and losing power. On a street car that needed to be both drivable and devastating, ignition reliability across the entire RPM range wasn't optional. It was foundational. So at this point, you might be asking the obvious question. If all of this was achievable, why didn't Chrysler just build it themselves? Why did it take a dealer in Chicago to figure this out? Look, the answer is more interesting than you might think, and it's not really about engineering capability. Chrysler's own internal engineers knew perfectly well that a 440 could be made to fit in an A-body platform. Their testing confirmed it would produce extraordinary performance numbers. The problem wasn't technical. The problem was institutional. By 1968, insurance companies were already looking hard at the muscle car industry, threatening to make high-performance cars effectively uninsurable for anyone under 30. A factory-produced compact car with a 440 cubic inch engine would have been a regulatory and liability nightmare. The braking system on the Dart was marginal for that level of power. The unit body structure wasn't designed for those load inputs. The corporate lawyers looked at what the engineers wanted to build and had what can only be described as a collective episode. Mr. Norm found the loophole that the lawyers couldn't close. He wasn't building new cars. He was modifying cars that customers already owned. The process worked like this. A customer would purchase a brand new Dart GTS from Grand Spalding Dodge, drive it off the lot as a legitimate retail transaction, then immediately return it for the GSS conversion. Technically, legally, this was aftermarket modification of a privately owned vehicle. Chrysler's factory warranty was voided, but Mr. Norm offered his own warranty in its place. The legal liability shifted from a corporation worth billions to a single dealership on West Grand Avenue. It was elegant. It was clever. And it worked. The conversion package wasn't inexpensive. The base Dart GTS stickered at $3,200 in 1968. The GSS package added another $1,200 on top of that. Nearly 40% of the car's purchase price for the conversion alone. But what that $1,200 bought you was remarkable. The complete engine swap. Every necessary modification to make the drivetrain, cooling, exhaust, and suspension work together as a system. The heavy-duty Dana 60 rear end. And Mr. Norm's personal guarantee that the finished car would run in the 11s in the quarter mile. That guarantee wasn't marketing language. It was a contractual promise, backed by the reputation of a man who understood exactly what he was building. The first GSS 440 hit Chicago streets in March of 1968, and word traveled through the street racing community the way word always traveled in that world. Fast and with embellishment that somehow still didn't capture the reality. Here's the thing about the street racing world in 1968. Reputation was currency. You couldn't look up dyno numbers on a website. You couldn't watch a YouTube video of a back-to-back comparison test. You heard things from people who had seen things, and you made judgments based on that chain of testimony. Word of mouth was the only algorithm that existed. And the word coming out of Chicago about Mr. Norm's plain white Dart was spreading faster than anything the traditional muscle car establishment had ever generated. The sleeper aesthetic was completely intentional, and it was genius. No hood scoops, no racing stripes, no chrome valve covers peeking through a cutout in the hood. Steel wheels with dogdish hubcaps that you'd see on a base model economy car. Tiny GTS badges that most people wouldn't even notice. The entire visual presentation of the car communicated one message. There is nothing interesting here. Move along. And that invisibility was a weapon in itself, because the psychological component of street racing has always been as important as the mechanical one. When your opponent doesn't know what he's dealing with, he doesn't prepare properly. He doesn't stage correctly. He doesn't drive with the focused intensity he'd bring to a car that looked like a threat. By the time the driver of that Camaro SS or that Roadrunner figured out what was sitting next to them, the light was already green and the conversation was already over. Performance testing by the handful of journalists and enthusiasts who managed to get their hands on a GSS produced numbers that were genuinely difficult to believe in context. Quarter-mile times ranging from 11.7 to 12.2 seconds at speeds between 116 and 118 miles per hour. 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. Now let those numbers sit for a moment, because they need historical context to fully land. The Lamborghini Miura, which in 1968 was considered the fastest production car on the planet, ran 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. A Ferrari 365 GTB Daytona needed 5.4 seconds to reach the same speed. This plain-looking Dodge Dart, purchased and modified at a dealership on West Grand Avenue in Chicago, would embarrass the most exotic European supercars of its era at a fraction of the purchase price. This is where it gets really interesting, because the quarter-mile numbers tell only part of the story. The deeper reason the GSS was so devastatingly effective against heavier muscle cars came down to physics that most people understood intuitively but couldn't always articulate precisely. Weight is the enemy of acceleration, not just because heavier objects require more force to accelerate, which is Newton's second law and not really debatable, but because weight affects traction in ways that compound across the entire run. A Roadrunner or a GTO with a big block was fighting its own mass from the moment the light went green. Those cars were spinning their rear tires through first gear, sometimes in the second, wasting power in tire smoke instead of converting it into forward motion. The GSS, with nearly 400 pounds less mass than a typical mid-size muscle car, put its power to the pavement more efficiently. The tires hooked, the car moved. Every horsepower the engine produced went toward acceleration rather than being consumed by inertia or wasted in wheel spin. The shorter wheelbase worked in the GSS's favor as well. At 111 inches compared to 116 for a roadrunner, the Dart transferred weight to the rear tires more quickly and more effectively under hard acceleration. That weight transfer is what generates traction. Generate traction faster and you accelerate faster. The geometry was working for Mr. Norm's creation in ways that raw horsepower numbers alone could never capture. The driving experience itself was something that everyone who sat in one remembered for the rest of their lives, though not always for reasons of comfort. At idle, the engine sounded genuinely unstable. The radical camshaft created a loping, hunting idle that shook the entire car at low RPM. It sounded like it was about to stall because the cam was so aggressive that smooth, low RPM operation simply wasn't part of its design brief. New owners reportedly spent their first few days of ownership convinced something was wrong with the engine before they learned that this was simply what it sounded like when it was working perfectly. The clutch on manual transmission cars was heavy enough to constitute a genuine leg workout in stop-and-go traffic. Power steering was absent because the header routing made it possible to retain without compromising exhaust flow. The steering was heavy and direct. The cabin was loud from the exhaust, hot from the proximity to the engine, and cramped by any objective measure. The seats were stock Dart units, which were never designed for high-performance driving. The instruments were basic, the amenities were minimal. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds absolutely miserable. Why would anyone choose to drive that every day? Because every single one of those compromises was a direct consequence of the car doing exactly what it was built to do with complete, uncompromising commitment. The loudness meant the exhaust was flowing freely. The heat meant the engine was working hard. The heavy steering meant nothing was diluting the connection between your hands and the front tires. The lumpy idle meant the camshaft was doing things that passive, comfortable engines couldn't do. Every discomfort was evidence of purpose. And for the people who bought these cars, that was the entire point. The handling, to be honest, was not the GSS's strongest attribute. Cramming that much engine weight into the nose of a compact car created understeer that became pronounced in corners. The front end pushed. The car wanted to go straight with significant enthusiasm. Mr. Norm never claimed otherwise because he wasn't building a road course car. He was building a drag strip weapon that happened to have a license plate. In the context it was designed for, the handling characteristics were irrelevant. In a straight line, nothing that most people could afford came close to touching it. Here's what most people don't realize about what happened next. Chrysler's response to the GSS wasn't public acknowledgement or corporate endorsement. Officially, the car didn't exist as far as Highland Park was concerned, but engineers from Chrysler's performance division started making quiet visits to Grand Spalding Dodge. They came with notebooks and measuring tapes. They asked careful questions. They took photographs. They were particularly interested in two things: the header design, which solved the packaging problem their own engineers had deemed too difficult to address in a production context, and the cooling system modifications, which demonstrated that thermal management for a big block in a compact body was achievable within real-world cost and packaging constraints. Mr. Norm had solved problems that Chrysler's own engineering department had set aside as impractical. And Chrysler, to their credit, recognized it. Other dealers began calling Grand Spalding Dodge with questions. How was this done? Could they replicate it? Mr. Norm responded by developing and selling conversion kits. For $450, any dealer with competent fabricators could purchase the headers, the motor mounts, the radiator, and complete installation instructions. The knowledge transferred. But here's what the conversion kit couldn't transfer: the level of attention, skill, and obsessive quality control that Mr. Norm personally brought to every car that went through his service bay. Quality among dealer-built GSS cars varied considerably as a result. Some were excellent, some were not. The originals from Grand Spalding remained in a category of their own. Production of genuine Mr. Norm GSS 440 cars totaled somewhere between 48 and 52 units across the 1968 model year. The uncertainty in that number is itself telling. These weren't factory cars with sequential serial numbers and production records maintained by a corporate documentation department. They were hand-built machines assembled one at a time by a small team in a dealership service bay. Each one was slightly different based on parts availability, customer preferences, and whatever solutions Mr. Norm found necessary on any given build. Some received manual transmissions, others got automatics, some retained power steering through creative engineering solutions. Paint colors varied, though the preference for plain, non-attention-seeking colors remained consistent with the sleeper philosophy throughout the production run. 48 to 52 cars. That's it. In a year, when Chevrolet sold hundreds of thousands of Camaros and Pontiac moved GTOs by the tens of thousands, Mr. Norm built fewer than 60 cars that would go on to influence the direction of an entire industry. The insurance industry noticed the GSS the same way a smoke detector notices a fire, quickly, loudly, and with immediate consequences. By late 1968, major insurers had added the GSS 440 to their blacklist of vehicles considered too high risk to cover at any reasonable premium. Some companies were quoting annual insurance rates higher than the car's actual purchase price. Think about that for a moment. You could buy the car for $4,400 all in, and an insurance company would look at you and say, "That'd be $5,000 a year to cover it." The math made ownership practically impossible for anyone without serious financial resources, which in 1968 meant the cars were being driven primarily by people who either had money or had made a calculated decision to drive uninsured and accept the consequences. Several GSS cars were reportedly crushed by insurance companies following accidents that were deemed too expensive and too dangerous to repair and return to public roads. The idea of an insurance company purchasing a car specifically to destroy it gives you a sense of how seriously the industry took the threat these vehicles represented. They weren't just expensive to insure. They were, in the institutional view of actuarial science, genuinely dangerous artifacts that had no business existing in a world governed by liability calculations and risk assessment tables. And here's the dark irony buried in that response. The GSS was in many ways a safer performance car than the alternatives it was competing against. The weight distribution was better than most factory muscle cars. The suspension had been specifically engineered for the power output. The Dana 60 rear end was more capable than what most factory cars were running. Mr. Norm had thought carefully about making the car work as a complete system rather than just bolting on power and hoping everything else kept up. But insurance companies don't grade on nuance. They grade on horsepower numbers and quarter-mile times and actuarial tables built from population-level accident data. And by every metric they used, the GSS was a Category 5 catastrophe waiting to happen. The street racing community had a different perspective entirely. Within the tight world of serious street racers operating in Chicago and spreading outward through reputation networks across the Midwest, the GSS developed a specific and fearsome identity. They called them Hemi killers. That name mattered enormously in context, because the 426 Hemi was the undisputed king of Mopar performance. The engine that Chrysler had developed specifically for NASCAR and drag racing, the engine that made grown men nervous at stoplights. Calling anything a Hemi killer was the highest possible compliment in that specific culture. And it was also a claim that invited challenge. Those challenges happened regularly, and the results infuriated Hemi owners with a consistency that became its own form of legend. Here's what most people don't realize about why the GSS consistently beat street Hemis despite the Hemi's fearsome reputation. The 426 Hemi made extraordinary power, but it made that power in a car that was significantly heavier than the Dart. A Hemi Roadrunner weighed approximately 3,400 pounds. A GSS 440 weighed closer to 3,000 pounds. That 400-pound difference at the same power level translates directly into acceleration. Physics doesn't negotiate. Add to that the GSS's superior weight distribution, its better launch characteristics from the shorter wheelbase, and the high stall torque converter that got the 440 into its power band instantly, and the outcome becomes less surprising. The Hemi had the more exotic engine. The GSS had the better complete package. In racing, complete packages beat exotic components more often than not. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all fascinating history, but why does it matter today? Why spend this much time on 48 cars built in a dealership service bay more than 50 years ago? Because the GSS 440 represents something that goes beyond automotive history. It represents a specific kind of human problem solving that we don't see very often and should probably think about more carefully when we encounter it. Look, the conventional wisdom in 1968 said that big engines belonged in big cars. This wasn't arbitrary prejudice. It was based on real engineering experience, real failure modes, real problems that had occurred when people had tried and failed to make oversized power plants work in undersized chassis. The conventional wisdom existed for legitimate reasons. What Mr. Norm did wasn't ignore those reasons. He addressed them one by one systematically with specific solutions rather than wishful thinking. The cooling problem had a solution. The exhaust problem had a solution. The exhaust problem had a solution. The transmission problem had a solution. The rear axle problem had a solution. The suspension problem had a solution. None of those solutions were obvious. All of them required fabrication skill, engineering intuition, and the willingness to keep working when each solution revealed the next problem waiting behind it. This is where it gets really interesting, because the legacy of the GSS extends far beyond the cars themselves. Chrysler's 1969 factory A-Body 440 program, which produced the 440 Dart GTS and the 440 Barracuda as actual production vehicles, drew directly from the engineering solutions Mr. Norm had developed. The header design was refined and mass-produced. The cooling system architecture became the factory blueprint. The suspension calibration was copied with minimal changes. Chrysler essentially acknowledged through action, if not through public statement, that one mechanic operating in a dealership service bay in Chicago had out-engineered their entire performance division on a specific and important problem. The aftermarket industry felt the influence for decades afterward. Hot rodders building big block A-body cars today still reference the original GSS build philosophy. The principles Mr. Six Norm established: manage the heat, strengthen the drivetrain to match the engine, optimize weight distribution. Think about the car as a system rather than a collection of parts. Those principles are foundational to serious performance building, regardless of the specific vehicles involved. Here's the thing about finding an original GSS today: it's genuinely rare in a way that most rare cars aren't. Most rare cars are rare because production numbers were limited by market demand or manufacturing capacity. The GSS is rare because the cars lived hard. They were bought by people who intended to race them, and they were raced, and racing at the level these cars were capable of meant that attrition was severe. Street racing accidents, mechanical failures pushed past the limits even of Mr. R. Norm's heavy-duty components, parting out when repair costs exceeded replacement costs. The survival rate for cars that lived the life these cars were built to live was never going to be high. Best current estimates suggest fewer than 15 original documented GSS 440 cars remain in existence today. A numbers match an example with documented provenance sold at auction for $240,000. That price point places it above many Hemi cars that were produced in far greater numbers and carry far more mainstream recognition. The market has made its judgment. Rarity combined with significance, combined with a story this compelling, produces values that transcend the original economics entirely. But the monetary value is honestly the least interesting thing about what these cars represent. The GSS reminds us that innovation has never required permission. Mr. Norm didn't wait for Chrysler to build the car he wanted to build. He didn't submit proposals to corporate channels or wait for engineering departments to greenlight his concept. He identified what he wanted to achieve, identified the specific problems standing between him and that achievement, and solved those problems with the tools and skills available to him. The result changed an industry, not because he had resources that others lacked, because he had clarity of vision and the technical capability to execute it without compromise. We live now in a world where performance cars are engineered by teams of hundreds, working with computational tools that Mr. Norm couldn't have imagined. Modern muscle cars produce power numbers and performance figures that would have seemed like science fiction in 1968. The regulations, the safety requirements, the emission standards, the corporate risk management processes, all of it means that nothing like the GSS will ever come from a dealership service bay again. That chapter of automotive history is genuinely closed. But the human quality that produced the GSS, that specific combination of technical skill, creative problem solving, and absolute refusal to accept that something was impossible simply because nobody had done it yet, that quality doesn't expire. It shows up in garages and workshops and small fabrication shops, wherever serious people decide that the thing they want to build is worth the work required to build it properly. Mr. Norm built 48 to 52 cars that the factory said couldn't exist. Those cars beat Hemis, terrified insurance companies, inspired a generation of performance enthusiasts, and directly influenced the factory products that followed them. He did it with a cutting torch, a welder, decades of accumulated skill, and the kind of focused obsession that turns impossible into inevitable. The 1968 Dodge Dart GSS 440 shouldn't have existed. That's exactly why it matters. What's the most outrageous engine swap you've ever seen or built yourself? Drop it in the comments below because I genuinely want to know. And if this kind of deep dive into the stories behind the machines is what you're here for, hit that subscribe button. There are a lot more stories like this one, and we're just getting started.